So how do we have our spiritual life? What are those experiences? Well, we have them all our life. They are the things we learn. They are the things we experience from day to day, from year to year. We learn first, usually, from parental and family figures, and then from teachers. But of course, we learn from our peers all along and from our neighbors. And not all the lessons are good or all the lessons are valuable, but they're all important. They're all part of our experiences, and they're all very real to us. And that's true with religions. 21st century humanity has an increasingly shared perspective because contemporary global conditions compel us to develop a common reality that allows us to communicate and cooperate by sharing scholarship, collaborating in scientific discoveries, using technologies, enjoying our creations, playing, singing, dancing, and listening to music, and healing our wounds. Intuitively, most human beings realize that each of us has some of the truth and that no one of us has all of the truth. And it is increasingly apparent to a majority of human beings that we can all learn useful things from any other person. I learned a lot from the immigrant garbage man in my little town. And I was in love with him as a 4-year-old boy because he had a horse and he came in a wagon. And my parents would let me ride with him to the dump, which was scandalous as far as most of my mother's friends in the music club thought, because, this was a lower class person in our town of 12,000 and didn't speak right and was doing the wrong kind of work. And I also learned from the caretaker of my maternal grandfather's ancestral estate in Georgia, who had the family name because her husband was a descendant of the family slaves. And I learned a great deal from her because I was an early riser and I would get up and go across from the house I was staying with my grandparents in to her little house across. And she would get on her porch with her gun and shoot a squirrel in the pecan grove, and the dogs would all run out and they were trained not to eat the squirrel. And so they would bring the squirrel back and she'd peel it and we'd have it for breakfast. And then I'd go home and have a second breakfast with my grandma and grandfather. So I just use that as illustrations because we all did that. We all had people that we learned from that maybe they didn't have degrees and they weren't officially great people or famous or going to be famous ever or even make a decent living by other people's standards. But we learned from them, and we learned important things from them. From that garbage man, I watched how people treated him, and I thought, man, this guy works harder than any of them, and he's older than most of them. And, it didn't feel right. And the same with Annie Lester. I learned things from her. And we do that throughout our lives. And so wherever we are, whatever we're doing, and most of us are so gifted, so fortunate, so blessed, and that we are allowed to do so many different things and travel to so many places and meet so many people in the course of our lives. The religious landscape is dramatically different. It was when most of us were born. Did you realize that fewer than half, 47% of Americans now belong to any religious congregation? It was 70% in 1999. It's quite a change. 70% to 47%. Half of Americans have changed their religions in the course of their lives, including many of us. And 25% of marriages are interfaith unions. In California, 27% of California residents are foreign-born. Half of California's children have a foreign-born parent. as my children do. The United States is now the most religiously diverse nation on earth. It's got more different kind of Buddhists than Japan. California is the most diverse state, and the Greater Bay Area is one of the most spiritually diverse regions in the country. If we Unitarian Universalists are seeking greater diversity and more members, reaching out to people that grew up in other religious backgrounds, traditions, and cultures is obvious and a necessary path. And, you know, they're not all farm workers and people helping you do your landscaping. They are your doctors and your dentists and your nurses and your accountants and your neighbors. Americans are not alone in this exploding diversity. Billions of people throughout the globe are well educated by contemporary standards, and like most of us, combine flourishing ancestral roots with an increasingly shared global outlook. I remember a moment when I was first in Africa in 1970. We were visiting a Maasai village, and we would kind of finish the village visit, and there was a young man, about 18, tall Maasai warrior, traditional garb, spear, and he addressed me in perfect English. And I said, well, what do you hope to do after secondary school? And he said, I plan to go to Harvard Medical School. Okay, so he was going straight, as many post-colonial people have done, going straight from several centuries ago by our standards, or Western European standards, to the 21st century, more or less directly, okay? And he's not alone in that. I mean, there's thousands, there's millions. I think at least this common group of people that really are much like us, or at least 1 billion of the 7 billion people on earth. Now, that's a lot of people. You know, that's not everybody, but that's a lot of people, and it's growing. I mean, it's exploding in the number of people that share so much. So people are different, and they are very different, and there are important differences, but there are also a lot of overlap. The world is also spiritually diverse. Of the 7 billion plus human beings, in excess of 2 billion are Christians. 1.2 of them are Roman Catholics, but the growth of Christianity is in the global south rather than the global north. 1.5 billion are Muslim, and 80% of them are Sunni Muslims. 1 billion of people in the world are non-religious by traditional standards, most in China and other communist countries. But there are also many in the US and other Western nations, including some people in any Unitarian Universalist congregations. 1 billion are Hindus, most in India, but more than 3 million Americans have ancestry from India. And we now have both a vice president and a presidential candidate that come from Indian traditions. 500 million are primarily practitioners of an indigenous ethnic faith. 400 of that 500 million are Chinese. 400 million. About 400 million on earth are Buddhists, and more than 1% of Americans are Buddhists, if not in ancestry, in regular spiritual practices like me. So my spiritual practice is as much or more Buddhist than a Western tradition. 23 million are Sikhs, and of the 500,000 Sikhs in America, most of those are just to our northeast up here, particularly around Yuba City. 14 million are Jews, and more than half of all the Jews are US citizens. 4 million are Jains, and there are a melange of newer syncretic faiths like Unitarian Universalism. The mother of my children, now deceased, was herself the product of a mixed marriage with a Hindu father and a Jain mother. The two families had known each other very well, had vacationed together, and the Jain family was actually wealthier and more urban. They both were Western educated partly. But when the Jain young woman married the Hindu Brahmin man, the Hindu father wouldn't let any of the family go to the wedding. Right? And as a Unitarian minister, it was fascinating to see how people would have rejected their progeny who had become Unitarian Universalists. And then a grandchild would be born. And suddenly they were there. And very often they'd come to the church later on and say, you know, I'm so grateful you did this. They had a community that fit them. And so that happens. That's real. We do it for people all the time. And it's an important thing that we do. Madhavi became a Unitarian Universalist, but she kept up her Jain and Hindu practices. And I find the Hindu view of God as the Brahman Atman, which is a combination of the universal powers that be and the elements in each of ourselves that share the universe's thrust of energy, evolution, and creativity. The Atman, to be the most useful divine image. I just think that says the truth, as I see it, better than any Western theology. My spiritual practices are significantly Buddhist, seeking to live with mindfulness, effective compassion, and engaged but nonviolent struggle for justice. My philosophical stance is significantly Jain, for the Jains for several thousand years have taught that truth inevitably remains relative and transitory, and that things are simply more or less probable. So they were following a probability view of the universe several thousand years before any place in the West. And that every aspect of reality continues to evolve. Taoism is Chinese mysticism, and Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching is the preeminent text for spiritual naturalism. And a great many Unitarian Universalists are naturalists. We love nature. We center our spirituality on nature things. I am a philosophical naturalist, and I've repeated Lao Tzu's admonition daily for more than half a century as a central guide of my life. Creative endeavor without possession, action without aggression, development without domination. It's hard as heck to live, but it's really important, and it's probably particularly difficult for people like a minister, although we're hardly alone in that. Confucianism is Chinese humanism. Confucian's insights about social relationships provide many useful guides for humanist practices. Western humanists often don't surmount their tendencies toward anarchistic libertarianism and materialistic egotism. Thank you. Taoism and Confucianism are useful tools to help Western humanists and naturalists become both more ecologically sensitive and more socially and organizationally effective. You know, the trouble with a lot of Western humanism, yeah, I mean, it's great philosophically, but like sometimes Unitarian congregations, they can't get themselves to do very much. You know, they can't go forward. They can't get organized because they're too busy still discussing the language or whatever. You know, language is good. Language is important. But, I mean, you really have to get down it and do things, you know, and work together. And if you can't do that, you don't get very far. Japanese spirituality represents an ancient history of syncretism, of combining different religious practices. They adopted a great deal from Chinese practices. They actually imported Chinese to teach them trades, to teach them a lot of Chinese culture. And Buddhist thought as it came from Korea and China, combining them with their indigenous Shintoism, which sees the kami or the divine in almost literally everything. I love the Japanese concept of ame, A-M-A-E, which represents their concept of mature, loving dependence upon others. It helps the Japanese to become more other-centered instead of self-centered. I think for a lot of us, it's a hard concept. You know, we're so strongly in our culture taught to be independent, to be on our own. And it's an admirable quality. But the reality is, most of our lives, most of us are heavily dependent on other people. We're dependent on them, and we better darn well remember it, because when we don't, we get in lots of trouble. It's a lot easier for me now as an old person to do that, because I am dependent. You know, Kathleen helps me climb, sit up, climb up. She walks faster than I do now. And I was always the goat earlier, at least on the uphills of those hikes. I cherish and wish to live Judaism's intent to help to heal a broken world. The Hebrew term tikkun olam implies that each of us has responsibilities, not only to ourselves and our intimates, but need to help to heal, repair, and improve the world. But my Judaism is the Judaism of Baruch Spinoza, believing that people can be happy by learning to live rational lives, but need to make their reasoning, their appetites, and their environments compatible, because the habits of virtue take a lifetime of experimental learning. A lot of people seem to think virtue is kind of perfection. Nonsense. Nobody's perfect about anything. You know, this idea that constantly, every time there's any kind of crisis, well, so the politicians and the publicists get up and they say, well, how are you going to never happen this again? Hey, it is going to happen again. There's going to be another fire. There's going to be a flood. There's another going to be disaster. We're not going to just get to perfection. It's not going to happen. And so for me, virtue is the kind of everyday good practices that we all do. We don't think much about, but we all do them. We all have things that we do that keep the world going, that keep one another going, that keep ourselves going. My Judaism is the Judaism of Martin Buber, with his divine in the between, his God as a verb, the thous of ourselves and other people, like Socrates, the thou of the natural world, like Goethe, the thou of our spirit's potential, like Jesus. My Judaism is a God worth arguing with, and like Buber, not falling into the worship of Israel as a solely Jewish ethnic nation, or giving into that idolatry about any nation. I believe in patriotism, but I do not believe in the worship of a nation. Amen. I am not a Christian, but I try to be a Jesusian. And I think I invented that term years and years ago. Following the ethical messages and intents, but remembering that he really taught that all people are children of God, that the kind of relationship that he was trying to practice is something that we can all aspire to practice. Mary Magdalene, at least among the apostles, got that. She may have been the only one. Like the practitioners of Islam, I bow my face on the floor at the beginning of my morning devotions. No, I don't do this as a way of pledging allegiance to Muhammad, or even as a way of bowing down to Allah, but in order to remember that life is a gift and that I am in the hands of creation now throughout my days. I could drive out of here and somebody could run into us on the way home, and that'd be the end of us. You know, it's all the time. It's every place. It's all the time. We're in the hands of creation. We can do our bit to try to delay and keep from harm. We need to do it in ways that are positive. Islam's long history of allowing those under Islamic sovereignty to practice their own religions is, on the whole, a much brighter history than those of the other Middle Eastern Western nations. Their admonition to give 2.5% of their wealth each year to those in need outside of your intimate circle is a practice I think could be a model for the world. Their history of supporting the scholarship of other cultures is also superior to many of our Western pretensions. Their practice of welcoming the stranger and being kind to the visitor are worthy practices for us all. My book is not an attempt to persuade you to practice spirituality as I do, or to believe as I have come to believe, but to provide a guide to each of the world's historic religions, because these religions are like each of us. They constantly evolve, they constantly learn and change as we go. And there's so much wealth there. It's like each one is like an amazing garden or a great and wonderful place in nature. And so we're simply missing out on things that we shouldn't have been missing out on to not pay some attention. Thank you for your attention to me, and I'm grateful to have been here.